Poor girl gave his son her last bite on a blind date. Unaware, he was a millionaire restaurant owner. What if the smallest act of kindness was being quietly watched? She didn't know he was rich. She didn't even know the boy was his son. All she did was offer her last piece of bread. And that changed everything. Stay with us. This is a story about grace, quiet strength, and the kind of love money can't buy. Their worlds had never intersected. One stood at the peak, with everything to his name, wealth, influence, and the admiration of those around him. The other lived a life of quiet struggle, always trying to keep her head above water. Yet, in some strange twist of fate, their paths were about to cross. Jason Knight, a name synonymous with power and success, was a CEO of a tech empire worth billions. At 42, he had everything most men could only dream of. A sleek penthouse in the heart of the city, a fleet of luxury cars, and a life that screamed perfection. He was adored by his employees, envied by his competitors, and sought after by the media. To the world, he was the epitome of success. But Jason's life was a prison of his own making. Success had come with a heavy price: loneliness. The more he had gained, the further he had pushed people away. His childhood was a constant battleground, and his adult life had been a cycle of fleeting relationships, business deals, and long nights spent alone in sterile conference rooms, chasing a goal that seemed increasingly distant. Beneath the polished exterior, there was a man haunted by ghosts from the past, running from emotions he didn't know how to face. Jason had everything, but he also had nothing. He lived in a world of manufactured smiles and corporate handshakes. Yet, when the lights dimmed and the noise subsided, he was left with the echo of his own solitude. In contrast, Olivia Clark, though not living in the lap of luxury, had something Jason had long since forgotten: a sense of inner peace. She was a writer, one who had seen both the highs and the lows of life. She had been married once, had tasted the bitterness of a failed business venture, and had watched her world crumble around her. Yet, through it all, she had found a way to survive, not just physically but emotionally. She had learned to make peace with the chaos of her life, and that peace was her most prized possession. Olivia lived in a modest apartment, decorated with second-hand furniture and personal trinkets that reminded her of the life she had once dreamed of. Her days were filled with writing, teaching part-time at a local college, and helping out at a community center. She had no fancy cars, no designer clothes, and no mansion waiting for her at the end of the day. But she had a quiet strength that couldn't be bought, and a heart that was still capable of love, despite the scars she carried. She had seen enough of the world to know that happiness wasn't something you could buy. It wasn't in the expensive dinners, the designer labels, or the power plays. Happiness, for Olivia, was found in the small moments, in the quiet hours spent writing, in the laughter shared over coffee with a friend, in the way the world seemed to slow down when you allowed yourself to breathe. It was a peace that came from knowing who you were, without needing anyone's approval. It wasn't that Olivia didn't want more. She had dreams, too, but she wasn't willing to sell her soul for them. She refused to be another pawn in the game of life that everyone else seemed to be playing. She wanted something real, something meaningful. She wanted someone who would understand her, not just want her. The first time they met was by accident, or perhaps fate. Olivia had been invited to a charity gala, a favor from a friend who was eager to see her network with the city's elite. Olivia had almost declined the invitation, but she had promised herself that she would start taking more risks, stepping outside her comfort zone. So, in her simple black dress, with her curly hair pulled back in a messy bun, she walked into the event, not expecting much. She wasn't there to impress anyone. She wasn't there to win anyone's approval. She was just there to survive another night in a world she didn't quite belong to. Jason, on the other hand, was there because it was expected. As the CEO of one of the city's largest tech firms, he was often invited to such events, where he was expected to smile, shake hands, and make small talk. He had learned the art of socializing with strangers, of appearing interested in causes he didn't care about. But tonight, something felt different. The noise of the event seemed distant, muffled, as if his mind were elsewhere. He could see the people around him, their faces blurring into one indistinct mass. He had done this 1,000 times before. Yet this time something fell off. That's when he saw her, Olivia. She wasn't wearing the perfect dress, nor was her makeup flawless. She wasn't trying to stand out or make an impression, but there was something about her that caught his attention. She wasn't looking for anyone's approval, and that, for some reason, was exactly what Jason needed to see. Her presence was calm, almost like a gentle breeze in a room full of stormy winds. But Olivia wasn't impressed by him, either. She had seen men like Jason before, powerful, successful, and all too aware of their own worth. She had learned the hard way that men like him were never what they appeared to be. They were empty shells, hiding behind a facade of confidence and wealth. She didn't need that in her life. Not now, not ever. Their first conversation was awkward, filled with forced pleasantries and superficial comments. Olivia didn't care about his business, his wealth, or his status. Jason, on the other hand, found himself intrigued by her indifference. It wasn't that she was rude or dismissive. She was just different. She didn't need him to validate her, and that made her the most interesting person in the room. Their interactions were brief, but those brief moments stayed with Jason long after the event ended. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had met someone who saw him for what he really was. Not the CEO, not the billionaire, but the man who had lost touch with his own humanity. As the night went on, they both retreated into their respective worlds. Olivia back to her simple life, and Jason back to his empire. But that brief encounter lingered in the back of their minds. Neither of them knew it at the time, but that night was the beginning of a journey that would change them both forever. There was something about Olivia that made Jason question everything he thought he knew about life, about success, and about what really mattered. And there was something about Jason that made Olivia wonder if, just maybe, she could believe in something again. Something real. But neither of them knew just how much their worlds would collide, nor how much they would change each other. And as Jason lay in his bed that night, the haunting question that had been echoing in his mind for days returned, louder than ever. Could he buy peace? Could he buy love? Could he buy a chance at happiness? The answer was just beyond reach. But in Olivia, he might have just found a reason to keep searching. Jason Knight, the man who had everything. Jason Knight sat in his office, staring out of the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. It was a view that many would envy. Skyscrapers stretching into the sky, the lights twinkling like 1,000 stars in the night. But for Jason, it was a view he had seen too many times. His office was a symbol of his success, the pinnacle of everything he had worked for, yet it felt like a gilded cage. At 42, Jason was a man who had built an empire. As the CEO of Knight Industries, a tech conglomerate worth billions, he had achieved what most could only dream of. His name was synonymous with innovation, power, and success. He had made millions from his inventions, and the world watched him like a hawk, waiting for his next big move. But success had come at a steep price. The higher he climbed, the more distant he became from the people around him. His friends were few, his family fractured, and his personal life a shadow of what it could have been. His marriage, which had once held so much promise, had ended in bitter divorce. The woman he had loved, who had once stood by him, was now a distant memory. And though he had moved on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something vital had been lost in the process. Jason had always been driven, always looking ahead, never stopping to appreciate the present. He was the type of man who thrived on the pursuit of more. More success, more wealth, more recognition. But as the years went by, he realized that none of it had brought him happiness. He had a mansion in the most exclusive neighborhood, a fleet of luxury cars, and enough money to last a lifetime. But when he came home at night, there was an emptiness that no amount of material wealth could fill. He often found himself staring at the walls of his empty penthouse, feeling the weight of his achievements like a chain around his neck. Success had isolated him, and for the first time, Jason questioned the very thing he had spent his entire life chasing. His loneliness wasn't the kind that could be fixed with a night out at an exclusive club or a lavish dinner with a few high-profile associates. It was a deeper loneliness the kind that settled into your bones after years of never truly being seen. Jason had spent so long perfecting his image, building his brand, and conquering the business world that he had forgotten how to truly connect with another person. His only company was his work, and even it started to feel like a monotonous cycle. He had employees who adored him for his leadership, but they only knew the Jason who ran the company, not the man who sat alone at night, wondering if he had made the right choices. Jason had a secret that no one knew. He was afraid. Afraid of failure, afraid of rejection, and afraid of what would happen if he stopped. He had built his entire life on the belief that success was the answer to everything. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. He didn't know how to fix it, and that scared him more than anything else. That fear was his constant companion, always lurking in the background, reminding him that no amount of money or power could replace the things that truly mattered: love, connection, and understanding. Jason didn't know how to find those things, though. He had tried before, but his past relationships had always ended in disappointment, leaving him with more scars than he cared to admit. But then there was Olivia. She had appeared in his life like a storm, unexpected and fierce. In the midst of his carefully controlled world, she was a wild card, a person who didn't care about his title or his wealth. She didn't ask for anything, didn't want anything from him. And that, in itself, was a revelation. Jason found himself thinking about her constantly. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. Her quiet strength, her independence, and her ability to remain calm in the face of everything he had ever struggled with left an impression on him. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him. It wasn't the fleeting attraction he had felt with other women. It was something deeper, something more real. It was curiosity about her, about how she managed to live a life that seemed so different from his. He realized that he wanted to know her better, not because of what she could do for him, or because she could make his life easier, but because, in a world where everything felt so fake, she was real. She was raw and unpretentious, and that authenticity was something Jason desperately craved. But there was a problem. Jason didn't know how to approach her. He had spent his entire life controlling situations, bending people to his will, and getting what he wanted. But with Olivia, he felt like a stranger in his own skin. She wasn't impressed by his wealth, she didn't care about his status, and she didn't seem to want anything from him. He wasn't used to that. Jason thought about their brief encounter again and again. He remembered the way Olivia had looked at him with those piercing eyes, not with admiration, but with a kind of quiet curiosity. He remembered how she hadn't been swayed by his charm, how she had stood her ground, unbothered by his presence. And he couldn't get that out of his mind. For the first time in years, Jason was unsure of himself. He wasn't used to feeling this way. He was used to being the one in control, the one who set the terms. But with Olivia, it felt like he was starting from scratch. She had managed to do something no one else had. She had made him question his own life, his choices, and his beliefs. But what did it mean? Did she feel the same way? Did she see him as just another businessman, just another face in the crowd? Or was there something more there, something that neither of them had recognized yet? As he sat in his office, lost in thought, Jason realized that he had to do something about it. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Olivia had shown him something he had long since forgotten, the possibility of something real. And Jason wasn't ready to let that go, not without at least trying to find out what it meant. He picked up his phone and stared at the screen for a moment. He could send her a message, ask her out for coffee, or try to get to know her better. But something held him back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the realization that he had no idea how to navigate this kind of vulnerability. But deep down, Jason knew one thing for sure. He had to try. And so, as the city buzzed below him, Jason Knight made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to run anymore. He was going to face the fear, the loneliness, and the uncertainty. He was going to face it head on, because for the first time in a long time, he had something worth fighting for. Olivia Clark, the woman who didn't need saving. Olivia Clark had long stopped believing in fairy tales. She had been through enough to know that life wasn't a romance novel, and that real love was often messy, complicated, and painful. She wasn't looking for a Prince Charming. She didn't need someone to save her. The only person she was responsible for was herself, and after all the heartbreak and setbacks, she had learned how to survive on her own. At 35, Olivia had experienced more than most people her age. She had grown up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the only way to make a name for yourself was to leave. She had left. She moved to the city with nothing but hope in her pocket and a dream of making something out of her life. But dreams had a way of fading when reality set in. After graduating from law school, Olivia had worked as an associate at a high-powered firm. She had been ambitious, driven, and determined to make her mark. But things didn't go as planned. The long hours, the pressure to succeed, and the constant juggling of work and personal life had worn her down. Her marriage, which had seemed like a fresh start, crumbled under the weight of her career. It was the one thing she couldn't control. The divorce was messy, bitter, and left Olivia feeling like she had failed at the most important thing in her life. For years, she had poured herself into her work, neglecting her emotional needs and the people who cared about her. And when the marriage ended, she realized just how much of herself she had lost in the process. After that, she had withdrawn. She wasn't interested in dating, wasn't interested in being swept off her feet. She had given enough of herself to people who didn't deserve it, and now she was content with her own company. Her life had taken a different turn when she left law behind and started writing. Writing was her escape, her therapy. It allowed her to put her thoughts onto paper and create worlds where things were simpler, where love wasn't tainted by the mistakes of the past. She wrote stories of hope, of second chances, of redemption. But when she wasn't writing, she taught part-time at a local community college. The job wasn't glamorous, but it gave her peace. Her apartment was modest, a reflection of the simple life she had chosen. No designer furniture, no luxurious amenities, just the things that mattered. A comfortable bed, shelves filled with books, and a few pieces of artwork she had collected over the years. It was her sanctuary. But life had a way of interrupting even the most peaceful routines. And for Olivia, that interruption came in the form of Jason Knight. When she had received the invitation to the charity gala, Olivia had hesitated. She wasn't interested in mingling with the city's elite, wasn't eager to rub shoulders with people who only cared about status and wealth. But a friend, a well-meaning friend, had insisted. "You need to get out more. It's good for networking," her friend had said, which made Olivia laugh. She wasn't in the business of networking anymore, but she had agreed, more out of obligation than desire. Olivia had arrived early to the event, hoping to slip in unnoticed, hoping to be a wallflower for the evening. She had donned a simple black dress, one that wasn't flashy but still made her feel confident. She didn't care about impressing anyone. She had learned long ago that trying to impress people was exhausting, and ultimately, it didn't matter. As she entered the grand ballroom, she was immediately struck by the extravagance of the venue. The crystal chandeliers, the polished marble floors, the gilded details. It was a world she had never been part of, and one she didn't particularly care for. She stood in the corner, nursing a glass of champagne, feeling like an outsider in a room full of people who seemed to know exactly where they belonged. Then she saw him, Jason Knight. She had heard his name before, of course. Everyone in the city had. He was a legend, a man whose fortune and influence reached far beyond the tech world. She had seen him on the covers of magazines, heard him speak at events, and knew all about his empire. But seeing him in person was something entirely different. He exuded power, yes, but there was also an emptiness in his eyes, a weariness that she hadn't expected. Their first encounter was nothing remarkable. They exchanged a few polite words, but there was no spark, no instant connection. Olivia wasn't impressed by his wealth or his title. She had been around men like him before, men who believed that their success could make them desirable. But Olivia had learned to look beyond the surface. She wasn't interested in his power or his money. She wanted something real, something genuine. But Jason was different. He didn't try to charm her or flatter her the way most men did. He was quiet, almost withdrawn, and it made her curious. For the first time in a long time, she felt something stir inside her. Was it attraction? Or was it simply the need to understand him? They didn't talk much that evening. Olivia spent most of her time avoiding the crowd, sipping her champagne and watching people dance. But every now and then, her eyes would wander to Jason. He stood alone at the edge of the room, surveying the scene with the same distant expression that had first caught her attention. There was something about him, something beneath the surface, that intrigued her. By the end of the night, Olivia had made her way to the exit, ready to retreat back to her quiet life. But as she passed by Jason, he caught her eye. She hesitated, and then, as if compelled by some invisible force, she spoke. "You're not like the others," she said, surprising herself with the honesty in her voice. Jason turned to her, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Neither are you," he replied, his voice soft but steady. For a moment, they stood there in silence, two strangers who had been drawn together by some unseen connection. It was brief, fleeting, but it was enough. Olivia knew, deep down, that this was not the end. Something had changed, something had shifted. She didn't know what it was yet, but she was certain that Jason Knight would be a part of her life in some way, whether she liked it or not. And as she walked away from the gala that night, Olivia couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would Jason be another fleeting moment in her life? Or was this the beginning of something real? Only time would tell. The first encounter, unwanted collision. The days following the gala felt like an eternity to Olivia. She hadn't expected much from the event, but something about Jason lingered in her thoughts. He wasn't like the other men in her life, those who had passed through her world with only the faintest of marks. Jason's presence wasn't something she could easily shake off. She hadn't asked for it, hadn't even wanted it, but there it was, a subtle undercurrent to her daily routine. She went back to her life, to the hum of her apartment, the click-clack of her keyboard as she wrote her next novel, and the soft echoes of students' voices drifting through the halls of the local college where she taught. Her world, once again, had settled into a familiar rhythm. But still, she couldn't stop thinking about him. It wasn't as if Jason had done anything extraordinary during their brief exchange. He hadn't tried to impress her with his status or charm, nor had he offered empty pleasantries. But there was something in his eyes that made Olivia pause. Something distant yet present, as though he was holding something back, or maybe, just maybe, he was waiting for someone to see it. It was a week later when their paths crossed again. The coffee shop was a small, local spot she frequented for her morning caffeine fix. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, where the baristas greeted you by the drink you always ordered, and where the buzz of early morning chatter felt like a welcome hug. Olivia had come to love it for its simplicity and quiet. It was the opposite of the glitzy gala she had attended, the bustling corporate events that felt like another world. She stood in line, her thoughts still tangled around Jason, when she heard a familiar voice. "Olivia." She turned, and there he was, Jason Knight, in the same tailored suit that always seemed to make him look more like a businessman than a human being. His usual air of control was present, but something was different today. There was a slight hesitation in his step, a softness in his gaze that hadn't been there before. For a moment, Olivia wasn't sure what to say. The last time they had spoken, it had been nothing more than a polite exchange. But here, in the low hum of the coffee shop, something felt more intimate. "Jason," she replied, her voice calm but curious. "What brings you here?" He hesitated, glancing around as though unsure of his surroundings. "I needed a break. Somewhere quiet." He glanced at the line, then back at her. "You?" "Same," Olivia said with a small smile. "I come here to escape the noise of the world." Jason nodded, as though he understood. "Seems like we both prefer the quiet." The comment was simple, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. The world they inhabited, the high-powered, noisy world of business and ambition, often left no room for peace. And here, in this quiet corner of the city, they could find a small respite from the chaos. They both ordered their drinks and found a small table by the window, the light filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows across the wooden surface. The air between them was still awkward, but more relaxed than it had been at the gala. They sat in silence for a while, the comforting background noise of the coffee shop filling the space between them. Jason broke the silence first. I've been thinking about our conversation. About what you said. Olivia raised an eyebrow, surprised. About what? He hesitated before answering. You said I wasn't like the others. I've been trying to figure out why that struck me. Most people would see my success and, well, they'd think I was just another guy trying to prove something. But you didn't. Olivia took a sip of her coffee, letting his words settle in her mind. I don't need to be impressed by someone's success, Jason, she said softly. I've learned that what's on the outside doesn't always match what's on the inside. Jason looked at her for a long moment, as though weighing her words. I don't know what I'm supposed to say to that. You don't have to say anything, Olivia replied, her gaze meeting his. You just have to be honest. For the first time in their interactions, Olivia saw a flicker of vulnerability in Jason's eyes. It was fleeting, but it was there, and for a moment, she felt as though she had pierced the armor he had carefully constructed around himself. I'm not good at being honest, Jason admitted, his voice quieter now. I've spent my whole life building this persona, the successful CEO, the man who has everything. But sometimes I wonder if anyone sees the real me. Olivia didn't respond immediately. She let his words hang in the air, feeling the weight of his confession. It wasn't something she had expected from him, but there was something undeniably human about it. And for the first time, she felt a spark of sympathy for him. It's hard to be seen, isn't it? She said softly. To be more than just what people expect from you. I know what that feels like. Jason nodded, his eyes lowering to his coffee cup. Yeah, I guess that's why I've always kept people at arm's length. It's easier that way. Olivia leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully. It's easier, but it's not better. Jason met her gaze, his expression thoughtful. I know, but it's safer. Is it, though? Olivia asked, a hint of challenge in her voice. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like it's keeping you alone. Her words hung in the air between them, but this time, there was no defensiveness from Jason. Instead, he seemed to be considering them deeply. I don't know what to do with that, he said finally, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his lips. But I think I might want to find out. Olivia wasn't sure what had shifted in that moment, but she felt it. The distance between them, which had always felt like an unspoken wall, had started to crumble. She didn't know what it meant for the future or where this strange connection would take them. But for the first time, she felt a sense of possibility. As they continued to talk, the world outside seemed to fade away. There was no talk of business, no mention of the elite circles Jason normally moved in. Instead, it was just two people sitting in a quiet corner of a coffee shop, sharing pieces of themselves in ways that felt real. By the time they finished their coffee, the air between them had shifted. Neither of them knew what would happen next, but for the first time in a long while, both Jason and Olivia were willing to find out. Maybe I'll see you again? Jason asked as they stood up to leave. Olivia smiled, her eyes softening. Maybe, and with that, they parted ways. But neither of them could shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The growing curiosity. Days passed since their unexpected meeting at the coffee shop, and the quiet bond that had begun to form between Jason and Olivia lingered in the background of their lives. Neither of them had expected it to happen, nor had they sought it out. But something about their connection, quiet, unspoken, and unforced, had begun to take root. And for the first time in a long while, Jason found himself thinking about someone other than himself, other than his work, other than his constant need to control the world around him. Olivia, too, couldn't stop wondering about him. Jason was a mystery, a puzzle she didn't think she could or should solve. He was a man who had everything that most people could only dream of, yet he seemed to be carrying a weight, a burden that no amount of money or success could ever ease. She couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward him, though she had no intention of letting herself get too close. She had made that mistake once before, letting someone in, only to be disappointed. Still, despite her reservations, she found herself thinking of him often, his quiet smile, the way he had opened up just a little more that day at the coffee shop. He wasn't like the other men she had encountered in her life, those who wore their success like armor and thought it was enough to win someone over. Jason's vulnerability, his willingness to admit his own struggles, had been refreshing. It made her wonder what more he might be hiding, what part of him she had yet to see. Over the next few weeks, their lives intersected in subtle, unexpected ways. They ran into each other twice more at the coffee shop, each encounter leaving Olivia with a lingering sense of curiosity. There was no grand declaration of intentions, no promises made. It was just two people sitting together, talking about their lives, about everything and nothing in the most ordinary of settings. Jason had started to seek out these encounters, perhaps without fully acknowledging why. There was something about Olivia's simplicity that grounded him, something he hadn't realized he had been craving. She didn't care about his title, his net worth, or his legacy. She cared about who he was as a person, and that was both terrifying and liberating for him. For Olivia, those moments were beginning to feel like an escape from the patterns she had so carefully crafted. In Jason, she saw someone who had created a life for himself, but one that, in some ways, seemed empty. Yet, unlike many of the people she had met, he wasn't pretending. He wasn't living in the illusion of having everything figured out. He was just human, and that made him, in some ways, more interesting than any success story she had ever encountered. One afternoon, as autumn settled into the city and the crispness of the air turned the streets golden with fallen leaves, Jason found himself standing in front of Olivia's favorite coffee shop. He wasn't sure what had brought him here. Part of him simply wanted to see her again. The other part, the part he had been hiding from, wanted to know if there was more to her than what met the eye, if there was more to him than what anyone else saw. He pushed open the door, and the familiar smell of roasted beans filled the air. His eyes scanned the room, looking for her. She was sitting by the window, as she often did, her laptop open in front of her as she worked. The sight of her, serene, absorbed in her thoughts, stirred something in him. He walked over to her table, his heart thudding louder than it should have. "Olivia," he said, the sound of her name feeling both strange and familiar on his tongue. She looked up, her green eyes softening when they met his. A smile tugged at her lips, and for a moment, he could almost forget about the man he was supposed to be in the world. He was just Jason. "Hey, Jason," she replied, her voice warm. "I didn't expect to see you here today. I wasn't sure I'd come, honestly," Jason admitted, pulling out the chair across from her. "But I thought I'd take a chance." Olivia raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Take a chance on what?" "On you. On seeing where this goes." He said it quickly, without overthinking it, and immediately regretted the vulnerability in his words. Olivia was quiet for a moment, studying him with a careful gaze. She wasn't sure what he was asking for, or even what she wanted in return, but for some reason, she felt compelled to answer honestly. "I'm not looking for a project, Jason," she said, her voice steady but not unkind. "I'm not here to fix anyone, and I'm not interested in being fixed. I've done enough of that in my life." Jason took a breath, nodding slowly. He had expected that kind of response. He wasn't looking for someone to make him feel whole, but something about Olivia made him want to try. "I'm not asking you to fix me," he said quietly, meeting her eyes with an intensity he hadn't meant to show. "I'm just asking if we can stop pretending." Olivia shifted in her seat, her gaze softening. "Stop pretending? Stop pretending that we're both just fine," Jason continued. "That we don't want more than what we've settled for. I'm tired of hiding behind what people expect from me. I don't want to do that with you." The honesty in his words caught Olivia off guard. It wasn't the grand romantic gesture she had feared, nor was it a cry for help. It was simple, just a request to be seen, not as a CEO or a failure, but as a person. And in that moment, Olivia felt the walls she had carefully built around herself start to crumble. She leaned back, studying him for a moment before speaking. "I don't have any grand expectations either, Jason. But if you're asking for something real, I guess I'm willing to give that a chance." Jason's heart skipped a beat at her words, but he didn't let himself get too carried away. There was still so much they didn't know about each other, so many pieces of their lives that hadn't yet been shared. But for the first time, Jason felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. They talked for hours, their conversation flowing as naturally as the coffee that was refilled time and time again. They shared stories of their childhoods, their hopes, their regrets. It wasn't perfect. Nothing about their interaction was, but it was real. And for once, that was enough. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the window, Olivia and Jason found themselves in a place neither of them had expected, a quiet understanding. There was no grand promise, no illusion of perfection, but there was something that neither of them could deny, a connection that felt genuine. And though neither of them knew what the future would hold, they both knew one thing for sure. It was a chance worth taking. Part 6. Old wounds begin to surface. Weeks had passed since that afternoon at the coffee shop, and yet the image of Jason's eyes, the raw honesty in his voice, continued to linger in Olivia's thoughts. Their conversations had become a regular part of her life, casual and comfortable at first, but slowly they had begun to shift. She wasn't sure if it was the connection between them or the quiet way he seemed to unravel his carefully constructed world, but something about Jason kept drawing her in. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a shared bond that neither had been prepared for. But the more Olivia allowed herself to explore the space between them, the more she could feel the tug of something deeper, something she had been trying to ignore. She knew Jason's past was tangled in shadows. Everyone had told her as much. But what struck her most was the way he avoided talking about it. The glimmers of vulnerability she had caught in their conversations had been fleeting, only brief moments of self-awareness that quickly retreated behind his carefully maintained walls. That morning, after yet another heart-to-heart in the cozy corner of the coffee shop, Olivia felt a sudden wave of hesitation. She had seen his reluctance, his attempts to guard his emotions like an impenetrable fortress. But for some reason, she couldn't let go of the feeling that Jason needed something more than just her companionship. He needed someone who could truly see him. Not the CEO, not the man with $1 million smile, but the man who had once been a little boy, carrying burdens that no one had ever helped him carry. The tension between curiosity and caution had been building inside Olivia. She had her own wounds to deal with, scars from a past that still occasionally haunted her. She wasn't interested in playing therapist, and she certainly didn't want to make the same mistake of thinking she could fix him. Yet, despite herself, she found that the more she spent time with him, the more she wanted to understand him, the more she wanted to help him unravel his past. It was on a rainy Thursday afternoon when the cracks finally began to show. Olivia had come over to Jason's office to discuss a new project, one they had been working on together. She had agreed to meet him at the sleek building where Knight Industries was headquartered, but the moment she entered the lobby, the familiar weight of corporate coldness surrounded her. Glass walls, polished floors, the hum of sterile air. It wasn't her world. It never had been. Jason greeted her with a warm smile, but even as he led her through the hallways to his office, she could see the tension in his posture. He had been on edge lately, his sharp features more rigid, his smile more strained. She knew something was bothering him, something he wasn't sharing. Once inside his office, she took a seat in the chair opposite him, noting the way he paced across the room, his eyes distant. "I know you've been working late," Olivia said gently, watching him from across the desk. "What's going on, Jason? You've been distracted." Jason froze mid-step, his eyes flicking over to her. He opened his mouth to speak, but then closed it again. He seemed to be considering his words carefully, weighing whether or not he should reveal whatever was weighing on his mind. Finally, after a long silence, he spoke. "It's just the pressure. All of it. The company, the constant expectations. Sometimes it feels like everything is crumbling around me, but I don't know how to stop it." Olivia watched him, her heart aching at the raw honesty in his voice. She could see the strain in his eyes, the way his jaw clenched as if fighting back something bigger than just business stress. "Jason," she said quietly, "you don't have to carry all of this alone. I know you're used to being the one in control, but you can't control everything. You don't have to keep it all inside." He looked at her, his gaze almost apologetic. "I don't know how to let go," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent so long being the one who's strong, who makes the decisions, who doesn't let anyone in. I don't know what happens if I stop being that person." Olivia could feel the vulnerability in his words, and despite the discomfort of seeing him this exposed, she felt a profound sympathy for him. She knew what it was like to feel like the weight of the world rested on your shoulders, to carry the burden of your past without ever being given the chance to put it down. "I don't expect you to be perfect, Jason," she said softly. "I don't need you to be the strong, untouchable CEO. I just need you to be the real you. And I'm here whether that means being strong together or just being there when things aren't going right." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the rain tapping against the windows. Jason's gaze softened, his posture relaxing slightly. It was as if her words had created a small opening, a crack in the armor he had spent years constructing. "Do you ever feel like you're just running?" he asked, his voice heavy with the weight of his question. "Like you're chasing something that will never be enough, no matter how hard you try?" Olivia nodded slowly, her heart understanding the question all too well. She had felt that way for years, constantly running, constantly chasing a version of herself that didn't exist. A version that could somehow be perfect, be loved, be everything everyone wanted. It wasn't until she had let go of those expectations that she had found peace. "Every day," she replied softly, "but the hardest part is stopping. Stopping to realize that you already have enough. That you're already enough." Jason took a long breath, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I can ever stop. I've been so focused on building this empire, this legacy. I've forgotten what it's like to just be." Olivia stood and walked over to him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but the weight of it seemed to reach him. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered, his voice raw. "I don't know how to let go of everything that's been holding me up." "You don't have to do it all at once," Olivia said, her voice steady but warm. "Just take it one step at a time. You don't have to have it all figured out. And you don't have to be perfect." The tears that had been threatening to break free were finally there, lingering in the corners of his eyes. Jason closed them briefly, breathing deeply, as if he were trying to will the emotions away. But Olivia didn't back down. She kept her hand on his shoulder, waiting patiently for him to speak again. "I've been so afraid of failing, of being weak," Jason confessed. "I've spent so long trying to be everything for everyone else, but I've never asked myself what I need. You need to stop running, Jason. You need to let yourself rest. And if you can't do it alone, then let me help you. Let's help you." For the first time in a long time, Jason let the walls come down, just a little. He allowed himself to be vulnerable, to admit that he didn't have all the answers. And in that moment, Olivia realized that sometimes the hardest thing to do isn't to push forward, it's to let someone else in. The road ahead was still uncertain, and there were many things Jason had yet to face. But for now, they both knew that this was a step in the right direction. Together, they would figure out what it meant to stop running. Forced to move forward. The days following their conversation were quiet, but they felt different. Jason, for the first time in what felt like years, began to loosen his grip on the world around him. The relentless drive that had pushed him forward for so long started to ebb, replaced by an uncertainty he hadn't anticipated. He was learning to let go, slowly, but it wasn't easy. Olivia could see the changes in him. The way his steps were less rigid, the way his smile seemed a little more genuine. Yet there was still that underlying tension, the weight of his responsibilities that he couldn't easily shake. It was as if, for every moment of peace he experienced, another wave of doubt would crash over him. Still, it was progress. And for Olivia, that was enough. Their work together on the new project was moving forward, but something had shifted between them. The professional connection they had built was now laced with something deeper. There were moments when their conversations veered off the business track into more personal territories. Sometimes it was Jason asking Olivia about her past, about the moments that had shaped her. Other times it was Olivia asking him about his childhood, about the moments that had made him who he was. But still, there was something he was holding back, a part of him that he wasn't ready to show. Olivia had begun to accept that Jason might never fully open up. She had seen how his mind worked, how tightly he kept control of everything. He had built his empire on the belief that he could master everything, including his emotions. She had her own walls, ones built from years of disappointments and lessons learned the hard way. But she was beginning to wonder if, just maybe, his walls were stronger than hers. One afternoon, a few weeks after their conversation, Jason invited Olivia to his penthouse for dinner. She had hesitated at first, unsure of what the invitation meant. She wasn't interested in anything beyond their connection, but she also wasn't willing to turn away from the opportunity to understand him better. When she arrived, she was greeted by the sheer magnitude of his world. His penthouse was everything she had imagined: sleek, modern, filled with expensive art and luxurious furniture. The floor-to-ceiling windows provided an uninterrupted view of the city skyline, and for a brief moment, Olivia felt out of place. This was Jason's world, the one he had fought so hard to build, the world he had so carefully curated. Jason had prepared a quiet dinner for them, a small meal of pasta and wine, and for a while, they fell into the easy rhythm of their conversations. But Olivia noticed something that evening. The way Jason's hand would tighten around his wine glass when the conversation touched on certain subjects. The tension in his shoulders would return, and his eyes would flicker with a kind of guarded sadness that he quickly masked. "So," Olivia said as they sat across from each other at the table, her voice soft but probing, "tell me something I don't know about you." Jason's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if he was deciding whether to answer. He took a long sip of wine, his gaze drifting toward the city lights outside the window. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice low. "I'm not sure there's much to say." Olivia watched him, her gaze steady. "Everyone has something. A secret, a fear, something." Jason chuckled bitterly, but there was no humor in it. "Maybe, but I've spent so long keeping everything locked up. If I start telling people about all the things I've kept hidden, I'm not sure I'll ever stop." She sat back in her chair, her heart aching at the vulnerability she could see in him. This was the Jason she had been searching for, the man behind the mask of CEO and billionaire, the man who carried the weight of his past like a heavy coat, one that he couldn't seem to take off, no matter how hard he tried. "I don't expect you to tell me everything, Jason," she said softly. "But I'm here. If you want to talk, if you need to share something, I'll listen." Jason looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the silence stretched between them. The weight of unspoken words hung in the air. He shifted in his seat, his fingers absently tracing the rim of his glass. "I don't know how to let go," he finally confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been running from everything for so long. From my past, from my feelings, from the fear of losing everything. It's easier to control it all than to face the truth." Olivia nodded slowly, understanding more than he realized. "But control doesn't really give you peace, does it?" Jason didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood and walked over to the window, staring out at the city below. Olivia could see the tension in his back, the way his shoulders hunched as if he were carrying the weight of the world. "No," he said, his voice low. "It doesn't. But it's all I know. I don't know how to live without it." Olivia rose from her seat and walked over to him, her steps light, as if she didn't want to startle him. When she reached his side, she stood quietly for a moment, looking out at the city with him. She wasn't sure what she could say to make it better, but she knew that there were no easy answers. Sometimes, the only thing you could offer was presence, the willingness to be there, even when things didn't make sense. "You don't have to do everything on your own," Olivia said, her voice soft but firm. "You don't have to keep running. You can stop." Jason glanced at her, his eyes searching hers. "But what happens if I stop? What happens if I let go of everything?" "Then maybe you'll finally be free," Olivia said quietly. "Maybe you'll finally find what you've been looking for." Jason's eyes darkened, as if he were processing the weight of her words. For a moment, the silence between them felt charged, full of unspoken promises and unasked questions. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that," he admitted. "You don't have to be ready," Olivia replied, her voice gentle. "But you can start, one step at a time." Jason exhaled sharply, as if releasing a breath he had been holding for too long. He looked at her again, his expression more open than it had been in days, maybe even weeks. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly. Maybe it's time to stop pretending. And for the first time, Olivia saw the tiniest glimmer of hope in his eyes. It was fleeting, barely noticeable, but it was there. A crack in the walls he had built. A step forward, even if it was a small one. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and neither of them knew where it would lead. But in that moment, they both realized that sometimes the hardest part wasn't facing the future. It was learning how to stop running from the past. The first real step. It had been a week since Jason had opened up to Olivia. A week since he had acknowledged the quiet turmoil that had been consuming him for years. In that time, there had been small shifts. Tiny moments where he allowed himself to breathe without the constant pressure of perfection. But it wasn't enough. The fear of truly letting go, the fear of embracing uncertainty, still lingered, like an invisible chain pulling him back. Jason knew that letting go wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a slow unraveling, a process that required more than just a few kind words. He needed to face the deepest parts of himself, the parts he had buried for so long. That evening, Olivia had invited him to dinner. She had been patient, understanding that he wasn't ready to fully open up yet. But there was something in the way he had confided in her last time, a flicker of trust that he hadn't shown anyone else. It was as if, for the first time, he had allowed himself to acknowledge that he didn't have to carry the weight of his world alone. Jason stood at the window in his penthouse, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The city below was slowly lighting up, the streets full of life. Yet Jason felt like a spectator in his own life. For years, he had kept himself apart from the world. He had surrounded himself with people who admired him but never really knew him. He had built an empire, a fortress around himself, and yet he had never felt more alone. Olivia's invitation felt like a lifeline. He wasn't sure if he was ready to dive deeper into his own vulnerability, but he knew he couldn't keep pretending to be the person he had forced himself to become. Maybe, just maybe, Olivia could help him find a way out of the prison he had built for himself. He turned away from the window, glancing at the clock. It was time to go. When Jason arrived at Olivia's apartment, he was surprised by how cozy it felt. Unlike the stark, modern sleekness of his penthouse, Olivia's space was warm, filled with books, art, and a quiet comfort that seemed to reflect her personality. The soft glow of the lights, the smell of something delicious cooking in the kitchen. It felt like home. Olivia was standing by the stove when he entered, her back to him. She turned when she heard the door, her expression softening when she saw him. There was no pressure in her gaze, no expectation, just acceptance. "Hey, you made it," she said with a gentle smile, her voice as warm as the space around them. "I did," Jason replied, his voice a little hoarse from the weight of the day. He hadn't realized how much he had been carrying until he had stepped into her world, her space. It felt like a breath of fresh air. "I hope you're hungry. I made your favorite. Pasta," Olivia said with a playful grin, clearly amused by the fact that she had picked something he had once mentioned in passing. "I thought we could eat first and talk later." Jason smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. He had come here hoping for something simple, something real, but he wasn't sure what kind of conversation he was ready for. He had made progress, yes, but there was still so much left unsaid. Still so much of himself he was afraid to face. The dinner was quiet, the sound of forks scraping against plates punctuated by the occasional exchange of words. Olivia wasn't pushing him, and Jason was grateful for it. They spoke about trivial things, their work, the weather, the books they were reading, but there was an unspoken understanding between them that neither of them could ignore. After the meal, they moved to the living room, sitting on the couch. Olivia poured them both a glass of wine, and Jason felt the warmth of the drink spread through him. It wasn't the alcohol he was after, but the sense of comfort that Olivia's presence provided. The anxiety that had been weighing on him since the moment he entered her apartment began to ease, if only slightly. "So," Olivia said after a long silence, "how have you been since our last conversation?" "Really?" Jason's gaze shifted from the glass in his hand to Olivia's expectant eyes. He wasn't sure how to answer her question. He wanted to say that things had gotten easier, that the weight of his past had somehow lightened. But that wasn't true. The truth was more complicated. I've been better, I guess. Jason started, his voice slow, measured. But it's not as simple as I hoped. Letting go isn't easy. It's like trying to pull free from something that's been part of you for so long. Olivia nodded, her expression empathetic. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer a quick fix or a solution. She simply let him speak. I keep thinking I'm ready to face it, he continued, his fingers tightening around the wine glass. I keep telling myself that I can move on, that I can stop pretending to be someone I'm not. But then I realize I'm not sure who I am if I let go of all that. Who are you, Jason? Olivia asked softly, her voice not an interrogation, but a genuine question. Jason let out a long breath, his gaze unfocused as he struggled to find the answer. I don't know anymore. I've spent so much time being the CEO, the businessman, the successful guy, that I don't remember who I was before all of that. And I'm scared that if I let go of this version of myself, I'll lose everything. Olivia reached across the couch and placed her hand gently over his, her touch warm and reassuring. You won't lose everything. You just find something else, something real. And if you don't know who you are now, that's okay. You can figure it out. You don't have to have all the answers today. Jason's eyes met hers, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something in himself begin to shift. The fear, the doubt, the need to control, they hadn't disappeared, but they were no longer overwhelming him. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that it was okay to not have everything figured out. It was okay to be unsure, to be vulnerable. It was okay to not be perfect. I don't know if I'm ready to let go yet, Jason admitted quietly, his voice rough with emotion. But I think I want to try. With you. Olivia smiled softly, her fingers still resting on his hand. You don't have to be ready. You just have to be willing to try. And I'll be here, one step at a time. The room was quiet again, but this time it was a comfortable silence. A silence that spoke volumes. For the first time in a long time, Jason felt like he wasn't alone, like he didn't have to carry the weight of his past by himself. And that in itself was the first real step toward letting go. They sat there together, in the stillness of the moment, not needing to fill the silence with words. For now, it was enough to just be. When the world crashes down, the quiet peace that had begun to take root between Jason and Olivia was delicate, fragile even. Jason had started to believe, however cautiously, that maybe he could finally stop running from his past. Maybe there was a chance, a real chance for something new. But as with all things in his life, the calmness he was beginning to embrace was soon tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. It happened suddenly on a bright Wednesday morning. Jason was in his office, his attention focused on a set of contracts that needed final approval. He was about to call Olivia for a quick chat about their upcoming project when his phone buzzed. It was a number he didn't recognize, but the urgency of the call made him hesitate. He answered, expecting to be an update on business or scheduling conflict. Mr. Knight, we need to talk. The voice on the other end was tight, almost panicked. There's been an issue with the company's finances. We need you here right away. Jason's stomach sank as he listened to the vague words coming from his CFO. What's happened? He demanded, his voice sharp, his mind racing through possibilities. It's a breach. We've had a major financial error. A deal was mishandled, and it's worse than we thought. It could lead to a massive legal issue if we don't address it immediately. Jason's mind went into overdrive. I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said, ending the call abruptly. His hands gripped the edge of his desk, trying to steady himself, but the weight of what was happening was already starting to settle in his chest. His first instinct was to go into damage control mode. But the truth was, he didn't know where to start. The walls he had so carefully built were suddenly crumbling, and all he could feel was the old fear creeping back in. As he drove to the office, his thoughts were racing. This wasn't just a simple mistake. It was a breach of trust, a sign that his empire, which had seemed so invincible for so long, was on the verge of collapse. He had spent years constructing this world, and now it seemed as if it was all unraveling, piece by piece. When he arrived at the company's headquarters, the atmosphere was tense. His team was already scrambling, running between rooms and making phone calls. Jason's presence didn't immediately settle the chaos. Instead, It added another layer of pressure. His CFO, Greg, was waiting for him in the conference room, his face pale. "What happened?" Jason asked, his voice barely a whisper. Greg ran a hand through his hair. "It's a long story, but here's the short version. We made a bad investment. A risky one that we thought would pay off. But the market shifted, and we've lost millions. Worse, if this gets out, it could take the whole company down." Jason felt like the floor had dropped out beneath him. All the careful planning, the years of putting everything in place, had been for nothing. He was standing at the precipice of failure, looking down at a chasm he wasn't sure he could climb out of. For the first time in a long time, the weight of the world seemed too much to bear. His pulse quickened, and for a moment, the room seemed to spin. He needed to do something. He needed to fix it, to take control again. That was all he had ever known. "I'll handle it," Jason said, his voice steady, but the doubt in his mind was evident. "We'll make a plan, contain the damage, and fix this." Greg nodded, but there was no real reassurance in his eyes. "It's going to take more than a plan. We might need to consider pulling back on some of our other projects. And we need to figure out how to keep the investors from pulling out." Jason barely heard him. His mind was already focused on the numbers, on the people he needed to call, the board members he had to reassure. He knew he couldn't let anyone see the cracks. Not yet. Hours later, Jason found himself back in his office, the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders. His phone buzzed with updates, but none of them were good. Investors were pulling back. Legal teams were starting to get involved. It was a domino effect, and it seemed like there was no way to stop it. In the midst of the madness, Olivia's face appeared in his mind. He hadn't spoken to her all day, hadn't even had the chance to tell her what was happening. He didn't know if he could. She had become a source of comfort for him, but he couldn't bring her into this mess. Not now. But the pressure continued to build, the walls closing in on him, and he knew he couldn't do this alone. He wasn't sure when he had come to rely on her so much, but he had. He grabbed his phone and hesitated for a moment, staring at her name on his contact list. Then, with a deep breath, he pressed the call button. When Olivia answered, her voice was gentle but warm. "Hey, Jason. How's everything going?" The simplicity of the question almost broke him. He wanted to tell her everything, to unload the burden he had been carrying all day. But instead, he found himself choking on the words. I don't know how to fix this," he admitted quietly, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to remain composed. "I thought I had everything under control, but it's all falling apart." Olivia's tone immediately shifted, concern seeping into her voice. "What's going on? Tell me." Jason swallowed hard, running a hand through his hair. "There's been a financial disaster, a breach, and it's much bigger than I thought. If we don't fix this fast, the company could go under. And I don't know how to stop it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Jason felt the weight of her silence. He knew that Olivia wasn't someone who could fix his problems, but her understanding, her ability to listen without judgment, was something he desperately needed. Finally, Olivia spoke, her voice steady and calm. "Jason, I don't know how you're feeling right now, but I do know one thing. You don't have to face this alone. You're not alone." Jason's heart thudded in his chest as he processed her words. The truth was, he had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, on carrying the burden of the world by himself. But hearing Olivia's words, something inside him cracked open. For the first time in a long time, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to do it all on his own. Maybe this was the moment he had been avoiding, the moment where he had to let someone in, where he had to trust that he wasn't defined by his success or his failures. "I don't know what to do," Jason whispered, his voice barely audible. "You take it one step at a time," Olivia replied, "and you let me help." Her words were a lifeline, not a promise of a quick fix, but an offer of support, of being there when everything seemed to be crashing down. In that moment, Jason finally understood. He didn't need to have all the answers. All he needed to do was take the first step and let himself be seen. And that, for Jason Knight, was the hardest step of all, the quiet departure. The days following the crisis at the company were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and frantic discussions. Jason had thrown himself into damage control, doing everything he could to salvage what was left of his empire. But despite his best efforts, The weight of the situation never seemed to lift. The investors were still on edge. The press was hungry for any hint of scandal, and the pressure on Jason had never been more suffocating. But through it all, there was one constant: Olivia. She had been there for him every step of the way, offering quiet support, a steady presence in the midst of chaos. It wasn't the loud, dramatic kind of support he had expected from others, but the kind that seeped into the cracks of his life when he needed it most. She didn't try to solve his problems or offer empty words of encouragement. She just was a reminder that in the midst of all his success and failure, there was someone who cared for him, not for his wealth or his title, but for who he was beneath it all. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, Jason began to feel the weight of everything he had put on hold. There was a quiet resignation in the way he moved through each day, as though he were merely going through the motions. It wasn't just the company that was falling apart. It was everything. The cracks in his personal life, his relationships, and his own sense of self were growing wider with each passing moment. He could feel himself unraveling, and he didn't know how much longer he could keep up the facade. Olivia had noticed it too. She saw the way Jason's eyes had become clouded with exhaustion, the way his smile had grown more forced, more hollow. The man she had seen weeks ago, the one who had allowed himself to be vulnerable, seemed distant now, retreating into himself as if he were trying to escape the weight of it all. And so, it wasn't a surprise when, one evening, Jason asked her to meet him at his penthouse. His voice over the phone had been quiet, almost hesitant. When she arrived, the lights were dimmed, and the soft hum of city life filtered through the windows. Jason was sitting on the couch, his posture slumped, as though the weight of the world had become too much for him to carry alone. He didn't look up when she entered, his gaze focused on the floor as if trying to gather the words he needed to say. Olivia stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the sight of him. The man who had seemed invincible, now broken by the very thing he had built. She had never seen him like this before. He was always the one in control, always the one who had it all figured out. But now, she saw something in him that she hadn't before: fear. And it terrified her, because she realized that, despite everything they had shared, she might not be able to help him through this. "Jason," she said softly, her voice gentle. He looked up at her then, his eyes tired, as if he hadn't slept in days. "Olivia," he murmured, his voice barely audible. I didn't know who else to turn to. Olivia's heart ached at the words. She crossed the room and sat beside him, not saying anything at first, just offering him the space to speak. The silence stretched between them, and for a moment, all Jason could do was stare ahead, lost in his thoughts. "I've tried to fix everything," he finally said, his voice thick with frustration. "But it's like the more I try, the more everything falls apart. The company, it's crumbling, and I don't know what's left of me if I lose that. I don't know who I am without it." Olivia reached out, placing her hand gently on his. "You're more than your company, Jason. You're more than the empire you've built." Jason let out a bitter laugh, his hand squeezing hers as if trying to hold on to something real. "You don't understand. This is everything I've worked for. It's all I've known. Without it, who am I?" "You're still Jason," Olivia replied, her voice steady. "The man who made this empire, yes, but also the man who's been kind to me, the man who's been trying to find his way. You're not just a businessman, Jason. You're more than that." He looked at her, his expression raw with emotion. "I don't know if I can keep going like this, Olivia. I feel like I'm losing myself. I feel like I've lost who I was before all of this." Olivia didn't have an answer for him, because she knew that no matter how much she cared for him, she couldn't fix his pain. She couldn't solve the puzzle that was Jason Knight. But she could be there, and that, she realized, was enough. She didn't need to save him. She just needed to love him, to remind him that he wasn't alone. "You don't have to fix everything right now," she said softly. "You don't have to have all the answers. I'm here, Jason, and I'll be here no matter what happens." For a long time, they sat there in silence, their hands still intertwined. Jason didn't say anything more, but he didn't need to. Olivia knew that he had heard her. She knew that, for the first time in a long time, he was allowing himself to feel something other than the pressure of expectations. It wasn't the end of his journey, but it was a beginning, a small step in the right direction. As the evening stretched on, the rain began to fall outside, the rhythmic tapping on the windows adding to the quiet of the room. Jason leaned back against the couch, his eyes closing for a brief moment, as if he were finally allowing himself to rest. "I don't know what's going to happen next," he said quietly, "but I'm tired of pretending I have all the answers." Olivia squeezed his hand, a soft smile touching her lips. "You don't have to pretend anymore. You can be honest with yourself now. We don't have to have it all figured out. We just have to take it one day at a time." Jason nodded, the weight on his shoulders feeling just a little bit lighter. He wasn't ready to let go of everything. Not yet. But for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was on the path to something real, something worth fighting for. The road ahead was still uncertain. The challenges were far from over. But for now, as he sat beside Olivia, he realized that maybe the first step to rebuilding wasn't about fixing everything at once. It was about letting go of the fear and allowing himself to be seen, to be loved for who he truly was. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The past returns to test the future. The weeks following that night at Jason's penthouse were a mixture of hope and uncertainty. For the first time, Jason felt as though he could breathe without the crushing weight of perfection suffocating him. His world still seemed on the brink of collapse. The company was teetering on the edge, and the investors were still reluctant to fully commit. But there was a change in him. He was allowing himself to exist outside of the empire he had built. And though he wasn't yet ready to let go of everything, he had started to open up to the possibility of something more. Olivia had been there through it all, quietly supporting him, giving him space when needed, but never once pulling away. She had become his anchor, though she wasn't fully aware of how deeply she had rooted herself in his life. Jason had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, on being able to manage everything on his own, but for the first time, he was allowing someone else to share the weight of his struggles. But as with any growth, there were inevitable setbacks. And when the past came calling, Jason wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. One late afternoon, as Jason sat in his office, trying to focus on the business proposals that had been flooding in, his phone rang. The name that flashed across the screen made his stomach tighten. He hesitated for a moment, his mind racing through the possible reasons why she would be calling now. "Hello." Jason's voice was calm, but it didn't mask the tension behind it. "Jason," a familiar voice said, its sweetness laced with something that didn't sit well with him. "I think it's time we talked." It was Claire, his ex-wife, the woman he had loved once, but whose departure had left him broken in ways he hadn't known how to heal. The wounds of their marriage had long since scarred over, but the pain still remained beneath the surface. "Claire," Jason said, trying to steady his breath. "Why are you calling now?" "I think you know," she replied smoothly. "I heard about the situation with the company. The investors. I just wanted to check in. I know this is a difficult time for you, Jason. And you know I'm always here if you need someone." Jason's grip tightened around his phone. He didn't want to go down this road. Not now. The last thing he needed was to rehash the painful memories of their broken marriage. Claire had left years ago, but the things she left behind, the trust, the hopes, and even the love, had all been buried under years of bitterness and regret. "I'm fine," Jason replied sharply. "I don't need anything from you." There was a long pause on the other end, and Jason could almost hear the smile in her voice when she spoke again. "Of course you don't. You never needed me, did you, Jason? You never needed anyone. That's why we're in this mess now." Jason felt his heart rate spike at the accusation, but he kept his voice steady. "This conversation is over, Claire. I don't have time for your games." But before he could end the call, she spoke again, her tone softer now, almost coaxing. "Jason, I'm not trying to hurt you. I just want you to understand something. I know what you're going through. You've always been so focused on building your empire, but what happens when it all comes crashing down? What happens when you're left with nothing but the pieces of your broken life? I've been there, and I don't want you to make the same mistakes I did." Jason's jaw clenched. He didn't want to hear this. Not now. Not when he was finally beginning to see the possibility of something more than just the business, than just the money and the success. He didn't need Claire's pity were her reminders of all the mistakes he had made. "I've already learned that lesson, Claire," he said, his voice cold now. "And I don't need you to remind me of it." Before she could respond, he hung up, his chest tight with frustration. He didn't need to go back there. He didn't need to reopen the wounds that had already scarred over. But as he sat in the quiet of his office, the weight of her words settled in. What happens when it all comes crashing down? That was the question that had haunted him for years. The fear that no matter how much he built, no matter how successful he became, it could all disappear in an instant. And if that happened, who would he be then? Jason leaned back in his chair, staring out at the city, the lights flickering in the distance. He had tried to bury those fears, tried to ignore the possibility of failure. But Claire's words had cracked open the door to those fears once more. Olivia could tell that something was off when Jason showed up for their dinner that evening. He had been distant, lost in his thoughts. She noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept flickering between her and the ground, as if he were trying to keep something from her. "Jason, what happened?" she asked gently, her voice filled with concern as they sat down at the table. "You've been quiet all evening." He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he considered telling her, but then the words got stuck in his throat. He couldn't bring himself to share the conversation with Claire, not yet. "It's nothing," Jason said, his voice strained. "Just some business stuff. It's been a long day." Olivia wasn't fooled. She could see the way his eyes darted around, how he fidgeted with his fork, as if trying to distract himself from whatever was troubling him. "You know you can talk to me, right?" Olivia said softly, her eyes locking onto his. "You don't have to keep everything inside." Jason's gaze softened, but he still didn't say anything. He wasn't ready to burden her with the weight of Claire's return, with the fear that still clung to his chest. He had already asked for too much from her. He couldn't ask her to fix his past, too. But Olivia wasn't asking him to fix anything. She wasn't asking him to be perfect. She was just asking him to be honest. Jason's gaze dropped to the table, his fingers stilling on his glass. For the first time, he allowed himself to be vulnerable, to face the reality of what he was really afraid of. Not just the collapse of his business, but the collapse of everything he had built, including his ability to trust anyone, including Olivia. "I don't know if I can do this," he whispered, the words finally escaping. "I don't know if I can face everything, all the mistakes I've made, everything I've lost." Olivia reached across the table, her hand covering his. "You don't have to face it alone, Jason. You don't have to carry this on your own anymore." For the first time in a long while, Jason didn't pull away. He let her hand stay there, a silent promise that no matter how much the world had tested him, he wouldn't have to face it alone. The future was still uncertain. The challenges were far from over. But for the first time, Jason realized that facing the past was no longer something he had to do in isolation. He had someone by his side, someone who would help him rebuild. One step at a time. A late confession, but a true one. The days following Jason's quiet admission to Olivia were filled with a strange mix of calm and unease. The calm came from the fact that Jason had finally allowed himself to be open, to be vulnerable in a way that he hadn't been in years. He had let go, just a little, of the walls he had built so meticulously around himself. Olivia, always steady and patient, had given him the space to breathe. But with that calm came a sense of unease, too. Jason couldn't help but feel the weight of his own fragility, now exposed in ways he hadn't anticipated. Admitting that he was afraid, that he was uncertain of his future, had given him some relief. But it had also opened up a floodgate of emotions he had buried under the relentless pursuit of success. He realized now that while he had been chasing wealth and power, he had left behind pieces of himself, bits of his humanity that were still aching to be whole again. Olivia noticed the shift in him. He was more present, more attentive, but there was still a certain distance in his eyes, a shadow that lingered when his gaze drifted off into the distance. It wasn't that Jason was closing off again, far from it. He was simply learning what it meant to live in the present, to not constantly fight against the past or the future. But Olivia had also seen the cracks in his armor. Jason might have admitted his fears to her, but she knew there was still something unspoken, something deeper that he wasn't ready to reveal. She didn't push him. Instead, she chose to be there, to give him the space he needed while making it clear that she wasn't going anywhere. It was a quiet Sunday morning, just a few weeks after Jason had confessed his struggles, when Olivia received a message from him. "Can we talk tonight? There's something I need to say." Her heart skipped a beat as she read the words. She could sense the seriousness in them, the weight of what Jason might be about to share. They had come a long way, but something about the message made her nervous. Jason had always been a man of control, of calculated decisions. If he was asking for a conversation, it meant something significant. She replied quickly, her fingers moving over the keys with a sense of urgency. "Of course, whenever you're ready." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, Olivia found herself pacing in her apartment. Her thoughts raced. What could he possibly have to tell her? He had already revealed so much, but there was still that elusive part of him that she couldn't quite reach. The part he had yet to share, the part of his past that he hadn't fully allowed himself to confront. She had always believed in honesty, in openness. She knew that if their relationship was going to move forward, they would need to continue being honest with each other. But what if this was something that changed everything? When Jason arrived at her apartment, his face was tired, his steps slower than usual. He greeted her with a small, strained smile, but there was something heavier about his presence tonight. Olivia didn't say anything, just gestured for him to sit, offering him a glass of wine as they sat down together. Jason took a deep breath, staring at the glass in his hands, his fingers tracing the rim absent-mindedly. For a long time, he didn't speak. The silence between them stretched, each second filled with the anticipation of something he hadn't been able to say before. "I've been thinking about something for a while now," Jason said finally, his voice low, almost hesitant, "about all the things I've been carrying, things I've never really shared with anyone." Olivia leaned in slightly, her gaze soft and encouraging. "You don't have to share anything you're not ready to," she said gently. "But if you do, I'm here." Jason nodded, but his expression didn't change. The weight of his own thoughts seemed to weigh on him, holding him back from saying what he needed to. But then, as though a switch had been flipped, he finally spoke, his words coming out in a rush. "When Claire left, it broke me in ways I never really understood until now," Jason began, his voice cracking slightly. "I always thought I was strong enough to handle anything, that I could just push through the pain, bury it deep inside. But after she walked away, I couldn't hide from it anymore. I had to turn that pain into something else. I turned it into success, into work, into building something that I thought would make me feel whole again." Olivia's heart ached as she listened, as she finally heard the unspoken truth in Jason's voice. He had never truly healed from his past, had never truly let go of the guilt and the failure he felt when Claire left him. "I've never really told anyone how much that hurt," Jason continued, his eyes focused on his glass. "How much it still hurts. I've spent so much of my life trying to prove to myself, to everyone, that I wasn't a failure. But in the process, I lost myself. I lost who I was before all of this." Olivia's hand reached across the table, gently covering his. "Jason, you weren't a failure. You were just a man who loved someone, who tried, and it didn't work out. That doesn't make you a failure. That makes you human." Jason looked up at her then, his eyes searching hers, as if he was looking for something. "But what if I wasn't enough? What if I've always been trying to prove that I am?" "You are enough," Olivia said firmly. "Not because of what you've built or what you've achieved, but because of who you are. You're enough because you're willing to face the things that hurt, because you're willing to be honest, even when it's hard." Jason's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to breathe, to release the pressure that had built up inside him. It wasn't an instant fix, but it was a step toward healing. "I've been afraid of losing everything," he said quietly. "I've been afraid that if I stop chasing success, if I stop proving myself, I'll lose everything. But you've shown me that I don't have to do that. I don't have to be perfect." Olivia smiled gently, squeezing his hand. "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be you." Jason looked at her for a long moment, the vulnerability in his gaze matching the tenderness in her touch. "I don't know what the future holds, Olivia," he said, his voice sincere. but I'm not afraid of it anymore. Not if you're by my side. The weight of his confession hung in the air, but this time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a release, like a step towards something better, something more real. Olivia leaned in, her hand resting on his cheek, her thumb brushing gently across his skin. "One day at a time, Jason," she whispered. "One day at a time." And for the first time in years, Jason didn't feel like he was fighting alone. He wasn't alone in his fears, his pain, or his hope for something better. And that, he realized, was enough. Forgiveness. Not because we are weak, but because we understand. The weeks that followed Jason's quiet confession were both transformative and challenging. He had opened the door to a side of himself that he had locked away for so long. His life was no longer just about the company, the empire he had built, or the success he had once believed defined him. There was more to him now, more than just the man with the title and the wealth. And as he began to peel back those layers, Olivia remained by his side, steady and unwavering. But even with the progress they had made, there was still something heavy hanging over them both. Jason had allowed himself to confront the man he had become, but there was another piece of his past that needed to be addressed. The one person who had always been a reminder of the things he couldn't fix, the woman who had left him broken. Claire. The name had not come up much since their conversation, and Jason had kept the distance between them that had grown over the years. But the truth was, as much as he had tried to bury his feelings about their marriage, the pain lingered. Olivia had encouraged him to take the time he needed to heal, to not rush into anything. She understood that healing wasn't linear. But even Olivia knew that there were things Jason couldn't keep running from forever. It was a Sunday evening when Jason received another call from Claire. The number was unfamiliar, but the moment he saw it, he knew. He had been expecting it, even if he didn't want to admit it. His heart raced, and his first instinct was to ignore the call, to shut out the woman who had once been his entire world. But something within him told him to answer. It wasn't about wanting closure or anything from the past. It was about facing the last piece of his fear, the fear of what would happen if he didn't finally address everything that had been left unsaid. He picked up the phone, the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. "Jason," Claire's voice came through, familiar and yet distant. It had been years since they had spoken like this. She had always had a way of making things sound so calm, so controlled, but Jason could hear the tremor in her voice now. "Claire," Jason said, his voice steady but not without the tension he felt in his chest. "What's this about?" There was a long pause on the other end, and Jason could feel her searching for the right words. "I heard about the company, Jason," Claire began, her voice softer now. "I know things aren't going well, and I just want to check in. I know you've been through a lot, and I don't want you to think I'm just here for your money or anything. But I still care. I want you to know that." Jason leaned back in his chair, the words hanging in the air like a ghost from his past. It wasn't the apology he had expected, nor was it the kind of closure he had imagined. But there was something else in her voice, something genuine, even if it was clouded by the years of hurt between them. "I don't know what you want from me, Claire," Jason said, his voice hardening slightly. "We've both moved on. There's nothing left to say." Claire's tone shifted, and Jason could hear the rawness in her voice now. "I know I left, Jason. I know I hurt you, but I've been thinking a lot about that time, about how things ended. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the way I left. I was selfish, and I didn't give you the chance to understand why. I didn't let you in, and I regret that." Jason's grip on the phone tightened. He didn't want to hear this. Not now. Not when he'd spent so many years burying the anger and resentment. But as much as he tried to shut her out, something inside him told him to listen. Maybe it was because he knew that he would never truly move forward until he had faced this part of his life head on. "Why now, Claire?" Jason asked, his voice quiet. "After all this time?" "I don't know," she replied. "I guess I thought I could just move on, that I could forget about it all. But I've realized that the things we leave unfinished, they don't just disappear. They follow us, don't they? I thought I could carry on, but the truth is, I've been carrying the weight of the past with me. And I don't want to do that anymore." Jason closed his eyes, hearing her words as if they had come from a different version of her, the woman she could have been if she hadn't left him in the first place. He had spent so much time thinking about her, resenting her for what she had done, for the way she had torn apart their life. But as her apology echoed in his mind, something shifted inside him. "Claire," he said slowly, his voice firm but not unkind, "I forgive you. I don't know if I ever really did, but I do now. I've spent too many years holding on to the anger, holding on to the hurt. It doesn't change what happened, but it changes me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Jason could almost feel the weight of her own emotions. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't deserve it, but thank you." Jason could feel the finality of it now. This was the closure he had been looking for, not in the form of some grand gesture, but in the simple acceptance that what had happened was in the past. He couldn't change it. They couldn't change it, but he could choose to move forward. When he hung up the phone, he sat there for a while, the room quiet around him. For the first time, he felt a sense of peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because he had taken the step that needed to be taken. He had forgiven Claire, not for her, but for himself. Olivia had been watching from the doorway, sensing the shift in the air when Jason had ended the call. She had known, even before he said anything, that this was a moment of transformation for him. "Is it done?" Olivia asked softly, her voice full of understanding. Jason nodded, finally meeting her eyes. "It's done. I think I'm finally done with it." Olivia crossed the room and sat beside him, her presence comforting and steady. "And now," Jason said, his voice more sure than it had been in a long time, "I can start living again. Not for the company, not for the past, but for what comes next." She smiled, the warmth of her understanding radiating between them. "One step at a time," she whispered. Jason took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, felt a genuine sense of relief. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer had to control him. With Olivia by his side, he was ready to face the future, whatever it may bring. And that, he realized, was all he needed. Moving forward together. The next few months passed in a quiet, almost deliberate way. Jason had done what he thought was impossible. He had let go of the past. There were no more long nights spent drowning in memories, no more holding on to guilt and regret. For the first time in years, he had allowed himself to truly face his demons, to not only forgive the people who had hurt him, but to forgive himself. And through it all, Olivia had stood beside him, never asking for more than he was ready to give, but always providing a steady presence when he needed it most. Their relationship had blossomed into something neither of them had expected, something that felt both natural and freeing. Jason had learned that he didn't need to control every aspect of his life to feel secure. With Olivia, he had found something real, something he had been searching for without even knowing it: unconditional acceptance. It wasn't about his wealth, his title, or his success. It was about who he was in those quiet moments, when everything had been stripped away. Olivia, on the other hand, had discovered that love didn't always have to be wrapped in a neat little package. It wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always smooth. But it was honest, and sometimes honesty was more than enough. As spring arrived and the city began to bloom with new life, Jason found himself waking up each morning with a sense of calm he hadn't known in a long time. He still had his work, his ambitions, and his responsibilities, but they no longer defined him. The pressure to always be perfect, always be in control, had been lifted. He was free in a way he hadn't been before. And for the first time, he understood what Olivia had been trying to show him all along, that it wasn't about achieving more or building more. It was about being present, being real, and being willing to face what life threw at you together. One evening, as they sat together on the rooftop of his penthouse, watching the sunset paint the sky with shades of orange and pink, Jason turned to Olivia, a thought forming in his mind that he hadn't quite verbalized until now. "I never really understood what you meant by one day at a time," he said, his voice contemplative. "But I think I get it now. You were right all along. We spend so much time trying to control everything, but sometimes we just need to let go and take things as they come." Olivia smiled, her eyes softening as she reached out to take his hand. "I'm glad you're seeing that. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture and forget that the little moments matter just as much. Sometimes the biggest step forward is the one that seems the smallest. Jason nodded, squeezing her hand gently. He could feel the weight of her words, the truth in them. He'd spent years fixating on what he had to achieve, on what was expected of him. But in this moment, sitting beside her, watching the world unfold around them, he realized that he didn't have to have all the answers. He didn't need to know what the future held. What mattered was that they were in it together. You know, he said, looking out at the city, I think I've spent so much of my life trying to build something big, something that would make people see me a certain way. But in the end, it's not the empire that matters. It's the people who are there with you through it all. Olivia's eyes sparkled, her heart swelling at his words. Exactly. I'm glad I'm one of those people. Jason turned to her, his gaze intense but soft. I'm glad you are too, Olivia. I think I've spent so much time building walls that I didn't even realize I was shutting people out. But with you, I don't feel like I need to hide. I don't feel like I need to be someone I'm not. Olivia's smile was gentle, her thumb brushing over the back of his hand. You don't need to be anyone but yourself, Jason. That's what I'm here for. Not the CEO, not the guy with all the answers, but you. Jason leaned back, feeling a warmth spread through him. The evening was peaceful, the city below alive with its own rhythm. It was as though everything was in its place, perfectly imperfect. For once, he didn't feel the need to rush. He didn't feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. He just felt content. The next day, Jason made a decision that would alter the course of his life. He knew that he had reached a point where he couldn't keep living in the past, and he couldn't keep working at a pace that would ultimately destroy him. The company, the investors, and the high-stakes game he had been playing for so long would no longer define his every move. He called a meeting with his board, something he had been putting off for weeks. When he walked into the room, there was a noticeable tension in the air. He could feel the weight of their expectations, the quiet judgment in their eyes. But for the first time, he didn't flinch. He didn't feel the need to appease them or prove himself. I've made a decision, Jason began, his voice calm but firm. I'm stepping back from my role as CEO. The room fell silent. Jason could see the surprise on their faces, the shock of hearing him say the words. But there was a part of him that felt liberated by them, as though he was finally taking control of his own future, not the future others had laid out for him. I've spent years focusing on building something I thought I needed, Jason continued. But the truth is, I've neglected what really matters, my health, my happiness, and the people I care about. I'm not walking away from the company, but I'm not going to let it define my life anymore. There were murmurs of disbelief around the table, but Jason didn't let them sway him. He had made his choice, and he was sticking to it. As he left the meeting, Jason felt an unfamiliar sense of freedom, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. It wasn't easy, but it was right. For the first time in years, he had put himself first, and it felt good. Later that evening, as he and Olivia sat together on the same rooftop, he shared the news with her. Her face lit up with a mix of surprise and admiration. I'm proud of you, Olivia said softly, her hand resting over his. I know that wasn't an easy decision. Jason smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle in his chest. It wasn't, but it was the right one. And for once, I'm not worried about what happens next. I'm just here, with you. Olivia leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to his cheek. And that's all that matters. For the first time in a long time, Jason realized that the future didn't have to be something to fear. It could be something to embrace, something to build with the right people by your side. With Olivia, he knew he could face whatever came next. And for the first time, he was ready. Together, they would move forward. And it would be enough. The open door, a new beginning. It had been several months since Jason made the decision to step back from his role as CEO. The immediate aftermath had been filled with intense conversations with his board members, some of whom had been less than thrilled by his choice. There had been questions, some doubts, and a lot of speculation about the future of Knight Industries. But Jason stood firm in his resolve. This wasn't about throwing away his legacy. It was about reclaiming his life, his peace, and his humanity. The empire he had built was important, but not at the cost of his own well-being. For the first time in years, Jason allowed himself to truly breathe, to live in the present without the constant pressure to perform or to prove himself. He no longer felt the need to answer every call, attend every meeting, or meet the expectations of others. He was learning how to let go, how to embrace the stillness without feeling like it was a void that needed to be filled. And with Olivia by his side, the quiet moments felt more fulfilling than any amount of success ever had. But stepping away from the company didn't mean Jason was abandoning it. He remained involved, though in a much smaller capacity. He appointed a new CEO, someone he trusted to carry forward the vision he had started, but who could also lead the company in a direction that didn't require him to be at the helm every single day. Jason began to shift his focus, investing in projects that mattered to him personally, charitable foundations, causes he had long been passionate about, and ways to give back to the community that had helped him get to where he was. Despite all this, there was a subtle tension in the air. Jason was changing, but the world around him wasn't necessarily moving at the same pace. People, friends, colleagues, and even family were still looking at him through the lens of the man who had once been invincible. They still saw him as the CEO, the billionaire who had everything under control. But Jason was no longer that person, and he wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between who he was now and who people expected him to be. As the seasons changed, so did his relationship with Olivia. The connection they had started was now a steady flame, growing stronger with each passing day. They spent time together in ways that felt simple but meaningful, cooking dinner, walking through the park, visiting places they had both wanted to see but had never found the time for. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic moments. Just the peace of being with someone who saw him for who he was, not for the mask he had once worn. But as they grew closer, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something still needed to be addressed. There were moments when he would catch Olivia looking at him, as if she were waiting for something, as if there were a piece of him still hidden away. And though he had made strides toward opening up, there were still parts of his past, parts of himself, that he hadn't fully shared with her. One afternoon, as they sat together on the couch in Jason's apartment, the light of the setting sun casting a warm glow over them, Olivia turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Jason," she began, her voice gentle but clear, "I've been thinking." Jason looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "About what?" "I know you've made so much progress," she said, her eyes meeting his. "I can see how much you've changed, how much you've grown. But I also know that you're still holding something back. I'm not asking you to tell me everything, but I need to know that you're not still trying to keep pieces of yourself locked away. I need to know that you're really here with me." Jason felt a rush of emotions, guilt, fear, and something else, something deeper. He knew she was right. He had come so far, but there were still things he hadn't let go of. Not just with Claire or the company, but with himself. He had spent so many years building up walls, and even now, some of those walls remained. "I am here," Jason said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "But there's still a part of me that's afraid of what happens if I let everything go. If I let myself truly be vulnerable. I've spent my entire life protecting that part of me, because if I let it out, I don't know who I'd be anymore." Olivia moved closer to him, her hand resting gently on his. "Jason, you don't have to be afraid. You don't have to be perfect. I'm not asking you to be someone you're not. I just need you to be real with me, the way you've been real with yourself." Jason exhaled, his eyes closing as he tried to process her words. The vulnerability, the openness, the trust it would take to finally let go of the last parts of his fear, it felt terrifying. But in that moment, with Olivia sitting beside him, her presence steady and unwavering, he knew this was the time. If he was ever going to truly move forward, he had to face the final step. "I've been so afraid." "Olivia," Jason confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid that if I let go of the last bit of control, I'll lose everything. I've always had this fear that if I open up, if I allow myself to truly feel, I'll be weak. That I'll fall apart." Olivia's eyes softened, and she squeezed his hand gently. "You don't have to be afraid of falling apart, Jason, because if you do, I'll be there to help you put the pieces back together. And if you're afraid of losing yourself, I promise you won't. You'll just find a new version of yourself, a version that's even stronger than the one who was holding everything in. Jason met her gaze, the weight of her words sinking in. He had spent so long trying to protect himself, trying to control everything around him, that he had forgotten what it was like to just live, to just be, to be loved for exactly who he was, without all the expectations, without all the walls. I don't know what the future holds. Olivia, Jason said, his voice steady now. But for the first time in a long time, I feel ready to face it. With you. I don't have to have all the answers anymore. I just have to trust that whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Olivia smiled softly, her heart swelling with love for him. One step at a time, she whispered, her fingers tracing the back of his hand. And in that moment, Jason realized that it wasn't about having all the answers. It wasn't about controlling everything. It was about trust, about vulnerability, about letting go of the fear that had kept him from fully living. With Olivia by his side, he knew that the future wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be embraced one day at a time, one step at a time, together. And that, for Jason, was more than enough. The key lesson from Jason's journey is the importance of letting go of control and embracing vulnerability. For so long, Jason's identity was defined by his success and the empire he built, but it took him stepping back, confronting his past, and accepting his fears to truly begin living. His story highlights that, while we often seek to control our lives to protect ourselves from pain or failure, it's the acceptance of vulnerability that fosters real growth and connection. It's easy to get caught up in the idea that we need to have everything figured out, that success or perfection is the measure of our worth. However, true fulfillment comes when we allow ourselves to be human, flawed, uncertain, and open. By embracing vulnerability and trusting others, we give ourselves the opportunity to heal, rebuild, and discover what truly matters. Life isn't about the walls we build to keep others out. It's about the courage to tear them down, step forward, and allow love and understanding to flow in. In my own life, this lesson serves as a reminder to let go of the fear of imperfection and embrace the beauty in simply being authentic. If this story touched something in you, tell us. Where in the world are you watching from? And if you've ever given something small that became something unforgettable. Because next time, we'll share what happened after she walked away. There's still one truth he hasn't told her yet.